Hello, and welcome to the November-December 2024 edition of Champion Brief's video topic analysis. I'm Daniel Shatzkin, the editor-in-chief of Champion Brief's Lincoln Douglas products, and today we're going to talk about the topic resolved. The United States ought to adopt a wealth tax. Benjamin Franklin has been attributed to the quote that nothing is certain in life except death and taxes. This is one of like the truest kind of idioms that has ever been told. Every adult pays taxes. You if you are working, pay taxes. No one likes to pay taxes. It is just not fun to do. It's a fact of life that we just have to deal with. But we pay taxes for a lot of good reasons, and we'll go into those reasons later in this video. But taxes are an inevitability. And our new topic asks us about a specific type of tax, a wealth tax. And in order to begin, we'll start with the question of what is wealth? Generally speaking, wealth is defined as the combined total value of your assets minus your debts. So all of your assets include things like cash, easily spendable or what we would call liquid assets. So that's like, you go to the store and you put your debit card in and money comes out of your bank account right away. That is a liquid asset that you have access to. Credit can also be an asset you have access to, but it doesn't count really towards your wealth. It's just something that you can access, but it ends up actually counting towards your debt in the end. So when we talk about wealth and we talk about access to money and stuff like that, we're really talking about your liquid asset of cash. And then on the other side of cash, your non-liquid assets are things like property and stocks. Property can't be anything from houses, cars, boats, planes if you're super duper wealthy, art, all sorts of stuff. Uh, and then you also have things like stocks, bonds, that all count towards your overall total wealth, but you may not have access to it right away, right? You have to sell stocks, you have to turn in a bond to get access to that cash. You have to sell property in order to get access to all of that cash. And all of those things tend to have taxes associated with it, which we'll go into in a second. But it's really important that we have this divide between the idea of wealth versus income. For example, let's say you have a person who has, $1 million in their bank account, right? You would say that person's probably pretty wealthy. But at the same time, what if that person's carrying around $5 to $10 million of debt? Suddenly that person's not so wealthy. Yeah, they have access to $1 million in cash, but there's so much debt that's hanging over that person that they really wouldn't be considered wealthy. And so when we calculate the idea of wealth, we would say that wealth has to be calculated with a subtraction of one's debt. And every year, if I'm making a lot of money, if I have a $500,000 salary, but I also have all of this debt sitting out there that my salary doesn't match, and I can't, meet my salary, meet my debt, and meet all of my obligations with my salary, then it doesn't matter if I have a really high income. I'm still really low wealth in that situation. And so income and wealth are really two different things. When we think about an income tax, you would talk about all of the tax that you and all of the taxes on the income that you pay. Right now, the tax rate for our progressive income tax starts at 10%, and that means that every person who earns $0 through about like 11,500 or so dollars, I don't remember the exact number in there, but it's about around 11,005, 11,006. You pay a 10% tax rate. And then for every dollar over 11,600, it goes up to then 12%. So then you'd pay 12 cents on the dollar for every dollar over 11,600. And that goes all the way up to 37% at around 600,000, somewhere over there. So the highest tax brackets really don't affect most people. In fact, the three highest tax brackets, the ones that are all over 30% currently, don't start kicking in until the income over $190,000. And that means all of the money under that is taxed at around 24%, 22%, 12%, and 10% in a graduated scale based on different incomes. Historically, that highest tax bracket used to be taxed at a much, much higher rate. When we go back to like World War II, that was actually taxed at a rate of 94% in 1944. That is the historic high of the highest tax bracket and tax rate within our progressive tax scale. Uh, it started going down in around the really going down in the mid 60s. Throughout the Eisenhower administration, all of the infrastructure building projects that our country had were funded by all of these high tax rates. But it starting in about the mid 60s, we started to lower that highest tax bracket rate. And then it really started accelerating under Nixon and later Reagan, and ending kind of in the Reagan administration. Notably, George Bush Sr., who has said no new taxes, and then he did actually have to increase taxes in some levels. That was just something that was gonna have to happen. Um, you know, that's one of the reasons he got hit is taxes. And so uh, there was an increase. It's fluctuated a little bit since the late 80s, but it stayed right around the upper 30s, lower 40%, and we're landed right now at our 37%. I have recorded this video after the election on Tuesday, and so I can say with all likelihood, the resolution is probably not likely in the next 4 years. In fact, if anything, we'll probably see the opposite of the resolution, and we'll probably see a decrease in the tax rate on the highest earners, just based on historical trends that have occurred during, Republican administrations. So it's very likely we'll see a tax cut on the highest earners, and if there is a tax cut at all on the lowest earners, is to be seen. It doesn't usually happen very often during Republican administrations. And when it is, it's usually offset by things that end up actually raising the amount of money that people pay, like the, the removal of state and local tax deductions and stuff like that. So it's likely that we'll end up seeing kind of the lowest rate of taxpayers ending up paying a higher percentage of income in the next couple of years, and the highest earners paying a lower actual percentage of their total income in taxes. That's just historically how it has happened. Most economists have said that that is kind of how it happens. That's the very basis of trickle-down economics that is pushed to lower that higher marginal tax rate. It's the idea that if super wealthy people have a lot of money, they'll pay people and start businesses and do all these things to stimulate the economy, and so they shouldn't have to pay that high of a tax rate. And so that's why we've seen our tax rate functionally go down from the historic high of 94% for our highest earners, now down to 37% for our highest earners. Uh, so that's just the income tax. We have a lot of other taxes that exist out there. There are things, capital gains taxes. When you sell stock, everybody pays a tax on that stock. That's around, I believe, a 20% tax. But that's a flat tax. Everybody pays the same rate on capital gains. There's talk about making the capital gains tax a more progressive tax system in which people who really earn a lot of money through selling stock end up having to pay a higher substantial rate. If you think about it, that 20% tax rate puts it at like would put it functionally at the third lowest tax bracket because it's 10, 12, and 22% within the progressive tax brackets. And well, yeah, average people like me do own stock. I am not a wealthy person by any, measurable standard. I do have some stock because it's an investment strategy for the future. the people who are really, really making a lot of money off their stock are making, millions of dollars, and they're usually doing things like reinvesting some of their stock so that they pay lower marginal tax rates on their sales, right? If you sell a stock and reinvest it, you don't then have to pay certain taxes on it. You got kind of get around it because now you're reinvesting, but you still will end up paying the sales tax or the capital gains tax overall in the end. Once that money goes into your bank account type of thing. Um, so that's kind of just the basic taxes that most people pay. Everybody also pays like property taxes. If you live in a house, if you rent an apartment, property taxes are paid to the city in order for, in county for services and stuff that your land gets, like water and all those sorts of things. I mean, you pay water, but there are also taxes that then are paid on all those things. So there are a lot of taxes that people pay that are very simple. Then there are things like the estate tax, and the estate tax would affect like 1% of Americans type of thing. The estate tax is at a super high amount that needs to get passed down. It's not like, your grandma left you a car in her will or something like that. It's about, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, that is being inherited. That's who gets hit with the estate tax. It's not the average person, right? The average person doesn't pay an estate tax when they get a watch from their uncle who passed away. That's not how it works. The average person will almost never be hit by the estate tax because the average person will never have the amount of wealth necessarily accumulated in order to have their the people they're passing on their estate to pay a tax for it. It just doesn't happen. Sometimes people like to call it the death tax to make people afraid of it. The estate tax is really a form of a wealth tax because it hits the wealthiest people only, and it's literally only on the accumulated value of assets that is being passed down, that it is being calculated on. The estate tax is probably the purest form of a wealth tax that we currently have in society. And even then, it's become so diluted that it's not super effective at the moment in curtailing the pass down of wealth. Um, so that's kind of how we currently tax. Uh, we also have sales taxes on things. We do talk about sales tax as a form of a regressive tax. Generally, property tax is also a form of regressive taxes. Regressive taxes are ones where if everybody pays the same tax rate, right, at let's say it's just a 5% or 10% tax rate, 10% of $100 is really a lot more to a person than 10% maybe of a person making $1,000 or $10,000 or, keep going up. When you start thinking about it, 10% of a million doesn't really affect that million, the person with the million as much as say 10% of the person that's only making 10,000. And it really starts to affect it. If you're only making $100,000 a year and you have to pay a 10% flat tax, and now you're only making $90,000 a year versus say the person who's making $1 million and they're paying 100,000 and now they're only making $900,000 a year, doesn't really kind of make sense. So when we talk about these like flat taxes as sales taxes, they're generally considered regressive taxes that harm poorer individuals at a higher rate just because 10% of a lower number is a lot more to that lower number overall in terms of their well-being. So now let's look at the why of taxes. Most tax theory comes out of kind of the ethic of social contractarian theory, right? We give up certain freedoms within a society in order to get benefits. One of those things that we give up is some of our money. Why do we give up some of our money? Well, different contractarians, different ethicists have come up with different justifications for why, right? You have Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, who all kind of give those early bases for governments forming together and social contracts. Hobbes would talk more about taxes for security. Locke would talk about taxes in a form of common good and to promote business. So different social contractarians would have different kind of theories on it. Utilitarians would talk about the maximization of benefits that taxes provide, right? They provide a benefit to all individual people within society because we all use roads, we all use the bridges, in a community, the railroads that bring goods and services all around our country is necessary for everybody, ports, airports, all of those things, that infrastructure that taxes develop, education system, right? So that there's a workforce that can be employable. All of that is by taxes. Taxes can help fuel civil society and make society better. It provides for all sorts of different stuff. And so utilitarians would say that it maximizes our well-being. Sort of similar, but in a different way. Rawls would talk about taxes as a benefit for the least well-off in society, and saying that a progressive tax rate, especially one that taxes the wealthy people at a high rate, but doesn't punish the wealthy for being wealthy, ultimately is a society that is the best society, right? Wealthy people can still maintain wealth. They can still be happy. They can still provide for their families, do what they want to do. But we also make sure that the least well-off in society are protected, that public services, public goods are all available. And so that would kind of be the Rawlsian justification. A very simplified form of it, but that's where it starts at. Kant, on the other hand, thinks of taxes as a form of civic duty, right? Kant talks about how public goods benefit all, and so all would have to pay taxes for them to ensure that the public good is maintained. Think of it like a commons, right? If there is a commons that taxes support and everybody has access to the commons, then everybody has a duty to pay into the commons in order to support it. Kant would probably support some form of taxes, but I'm not necessarily sure Kant would support inherently a wealth tax. Kant would probably say that taxes are a necessary part of society, right? It's part of our civic duty. But whether or not the wealthiest people have an increased amount that they need to pay versus, the least well-off in society, I'm not necessarily sure Kant would say that that's actually fair. But there are a lot of different interpretations within Kantianism as it's gone forward. And so there are a lot of different people that would maybe say that, the wealthy have their own duty. If they've earned wealth, they have a duty to give back more. Um, on that kind of vein of giving back more, you have kind of the Marxist moral economics, ethics that go around with that. Moral economics kind of talks about taxes as a means of redistribution in order to mitigate class divide. Marxism in and of itself talks about redistributing power and sharing power. One thing that's, very common is to say that, all communism is dictatorship. No, those are dictatorships that couch themselves in communism and populist economics in order to concentrate power on a different group of people than were already in power. That's all that happened. In Russia, you just replaced the czars with Stalin and the Central Communist Party. There was no real power sharing among the people. None of that happened. There was, a concentration of power among a new class of elites. In Cuba, you have a concentration of new power around Castro that was couched in populist economic language that never really was fulfilled, and all of the wealth that was transferred just got transferred entirely into a new class of, power holders. That was even tighter than the previous system of wealth and wasn't actually distributed out to the people. So, it's same thing has happened in Venezuela with Chavez and then to Maduro. So all of these people that, claim that they're communists and, Marxists or whatever, they're not. They've never practiced true communism or Marxism. Same thing in North Korea. It's just a concentration of power and wealth in a different class of people than how it had it before. Uh, and, try to, say that they were populist and doing good for the people when they were never actually doing good. Yeah, Marxism is really just about mitigating class divide and actually bringing everybody into a middle, a homeostasis middle point instead of, just creating a new class of haves and have-nots. Uh, on the opposite end is your market economists, like Keynes and Adam Smith, who would basically say that taxes kind of provide for public goods when businesses alone might not be able to provide for them. But those public goods should also enhance the ability of businesses to produce. So things like infrastructure. Infrastructure is one of the biggest forms of, public goods that market economists say is necessary. You can't have interstate trade if you don't have roads. You can't have international trade if you don't have ports and airports. So that's kind of the market economist view of it. Same thing with education, by the way. Public education historically was designed to have an educated workforce so that they could read how things would work. They know how to use machinery, and that they would listen to instruction. That is the earliest forms of public education, why and justifications for why we needed a universal public education system. It wasn't so that we had an enlightened society. It was so that we had, a workforce capable of listening and following instructions. And over time, we have turned education into a much, 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 much more meaningful endeavor for the masses. Only the elite really got a, deep critical thinking education historically, and now everybody gets a deep critical thinking education, uh, or at least they should. Um, and that's kind of, the new standard for it. So that's, the market economist's view. Education is a public good, infrastructure is a public good. Those are things that should be paid for. Uh, then you have people like Amarita Sen and Martha Nussbaum who take a human dignity approach to taxes and say that taxes are necessary to pay for the things that provide for human dignity. And so that would expand into things like, food stamps and food programs to allow for less well-off people to get food everywhere. That's why we pay taxes. And we make sure that, the role of government is to ensure the basic dignity of all people. And so, we pay taxes to ensure medical care for the uninsured and all of these things that promote human dignity, including stuff that we also talked about before, like roads and infrastructure and education and all of these things that lead to human thriving and the human ability to, be the best that we can possibly be. Uh, on the flip side to all of this is libertarianism. And libertarians basically argue for as minimal taxation as possible, if not no taxation whatsoever. You have libertarians like Rothbard who argue that, taxes are a coercive transfer of wealth, and that violates property rights. So basically, Rothbard says, what Marxists talk about taxes as a redistribution is true, but it's unjust. And that specifically it's unjust because it would violate a person's property rights. There's also libertarians who talk about taxes as a violation of autonomy based on spending, right? I don't like everything that the government wants to do, and so the fact that the government is spending money on things that I don't necessarily like is a violation of my autonomy, according to some libertarian theorists. You have people like Nozick, basically, who kind of take a Hobbesian approach that say that taxes are a kind of necessary evil for the most basic of things like security and infrastructure to do business, right? We need military, we need police, we need firefighters, we need roads, bridges, ports. That's about it. That's all the government really should be doing. Anything else is beyond the government. And even some of those things could probably be taken up by private enterprise and don't really need the government to be involved. But if the government wants to handle those things in order to make sure that the market works, cool. But the government shouldn't do anything else, right? And those taxes should be as minimal as possible and as equal as possible. And no one should pay more than anybody else, percentage wise, generally speaking, according to most libertarians. So that's kind of like the basic justifications for why we tax on an ethical and moral scale. When we start to look at, the impacts for a wealth tax, they're kind of divided on both ways. You have some people who say that a wealth tax will end up leading to less business being, less small businesses being started, less business reinvestment, may actually decrease investment in the stock market because people no longer view the stock market as a safe way to grow wealth, because if they're taxed potentially on what we called an unrealized gain, right? So, right now, let's say I have a stock that I invest in for $100. And at the end of the year, that stock goes up to $500. And I now have to pay taxes on that stock at $500. But the very day after, the first day of the next fiscal year, that stock tumbles and it's now only worth $50. I never had that $500, but I paid taxes on that $500. And suddenly, now my stock is only worth $50. It's worth less than it was at the end of, or at the start of the whole process. And well, yeah, technically that could be a loss on my next year, that's still a massive amount of unrealized gain. And it becomes a very complicated process to start calculating unrealized gain to unrealized losses on a year in to year out basis. And it's such a fluctuating value that how am I paying cash functionally, fungible cash that I can pay, liquid money, right, to the government on something that I still don't have access for. And so a lot of people would say that like a wealth tax, including an unrealized capital gains tax, would stop investment and really harm investment in the stock market. Uh, on the flip side, there are a lot of people that would say, though, that a wealth tax that maybe doesn't include an unrealized capital gains tax would actually help certain things like increasing salaries for lower wage employees because people would stop wanting to just keep hoarding wealth. If it gets taxed at such a high rate, it doesn't matter at the end of the year. It's not going to be in your wallet anyway. So why have like, a super high salary if my salary is just going to get taxed? Why have, all of these stock options potentially if they're just going to get all taxed? And so there are all of these things about how it could increase benefits and salaries for lower wage workers. It could also increase reinvestment within the business for long-term gains with R&D. Right now, there seems to be like this terminal problem within businesses where they constantly focus on their short-term gains and stock buybacks. Think about Boeing, for example. They focused on a short-term gain with building the 737 Max instead of spending more money in the short term, but creating a better long-term project with a better plane for the future that would be more stable. And now they've had all of these problems with their 737s that have gone on. And that was because they took a short-term business decision of getting a product in the market as fast as possible that probably wasn't a great product based on everything that's in the news on it. I mean, may or may not be, but like Now maybe it's stable, but at the start it wasn't, and it's hurt Boeing business wise. Any, business analyst would say it. And so when those things happen and you put those short-term gains, right, they got a lot of sales very quickly over the long-term proceeds of going with a new and better project. uh, Things start happening. And so bad things start happening, generally speaking. And so what a lot of people would say is that a wealth tax would incentivize research and development because it will lead to businesses investing more in their future gains and not their short-term gains. There's also talk about how it will decrease the income inequality gap. There's also a bunch of stuff out there about how currently we have a funding crisis in this country right now on a lot of different levels, whether it's healthcare and an aging population, whether it's military spending and having a problem between both modernization and sustainment for our military forces. Education is critically lacking in money. Look at all of the different listeria outbreaks that have been happening and E. coli outbreaks that are happening. A lot of that is because we just don't have enough inspectors, and the budgets have gotten so low on all of these things. And the Social Security is suffering, and we haven't had really good cost of living increases that truly match inflation in a long time. And so there is a lot of need for, an increase in spending in public goods and services that a wealth tax could provide for and talk about. But there are also some alternatives to just that pure wealth tax, and I kind of hinted at a few of them earlier. One of them is reforming the capital gains system to create a more progressive capital gains tax. And so that the more money that you end up earning at the end of a capital gain, the higher rate of tax that it would go. There are a couple of different proposals that are out there for that, but there are a lot of really interesting ones that make the capital gains tax a much more progressive tax. There are also things like luxury taxes, so taxes on second homes, on airplanes, on boats, things that we would generally consider luxuries, or that most average people would consider a luxury. Right. There are those options. There's also things like a national sales tax that have been floated. I'm sure based on the election results, we're going to hear a lot more about tariffs. Tariffs are functionally a regressive tax. Quick way about how tariffs function. So when something is imported into the country, there is a tariff that is added onto the fee of that. The importer pays that functional tariff to the government to get the product into the country. The person who then buys that product will then see a markup of price on that product to reflect the tariff that was charged on that product. So like if I buy, something at $10 and there's a 10% tariff on that product is going up now to $11 in cost for the consumer, because it had to go up $1 because I paid a tax on it as an importer, and I don't want to I'm not going to pay that. That's going to cut into my profits. And so that'll go to passed on to the consumer. And so functionally, then the consumer is actually going to pay a secondary tax because now the product is both higher and they're also going to end up paying their sales tax on that higher product. Tariffs are generally speaking a regressive tax that is designed to protect emerging industries. A tariff on every import is just really not practical or feasible for our national economy. Certain things like maybe saying like chips for national defense, steel, iron, all those things, putting tariffs on those kind of does make sense because you're about protecting a national industry that's critical for our defense and infrastructure. But tariffs on something like a t-shirt, probably not going to make sense and just pass along costs onto the American worker, and raise the price of a product because let's face it, textile manufacturing is not coming back to America in mass just because we put tariffs on those things. The only thing that's going to happen is you're going to pay more money for your t-shirts, your shoes, all of that. Uh, Tariffs are good in some targeted amounts, but not in others. And so there are a lot of debates that are going to be going on about all of these new tax programs that are going to be proposed in the new administration. What I'd urge you to do when looking at all of these new tax programs for either plans for a wealth tax or plans for a counter plan is to look at the evidence and find evidence that actually cites empirical examples of how the taxes have worked in the past. That is always going to be your best way to do it. If you're just going to make a claim that a tax works, that's not enough. You have to show why the tax works in order to win these rounds. Thank you all very much for listening. Good luck on your debates in November, December, and I look forward to hearing some really interesting ideas on how we can work to solve wealth inequality and maybe change our tax codes. Good luck, everybody.